Thank you, and thank you for that excellent comparative insight. Now, I'd ask everyone to come back to the panel. We have about 25 minutes for panel discussion, so I'd ask you for comments or questions, or as they say, mini speeches from the floor. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentations. I have a comment for the question for Richard the speaker. In your presentation, there seem to be some assumptions around what interest the state serves. And I have to question this idea of the state as balancing or safeguarding diverse interests, at least in an even sense. Many states really do not safeguard environmental interests to the same extent as they protect corporate rights. And even the Norwegian government, as part and full owner of many Norwegian companies, takes a very hands-off approach towards them and has a very passive ownership stance. And some of these companies are purely treated as commercial interests, and the state has not intervened on key environmental issues. One example being the oil company Statoil. The state has not intervened at all in their operations in the Alberta tar sands or the Arctic. And so I'm wondering, how can this be taken into account in your proposal around increasing political participation on boards?
Very good point. I don't think that if we look at, I don't know, Western Europe, I don't think there are many states that encompass that function at the moment. It's something that, and that's why I see, the first assumption is that the state is a democratic underpinning entity. From then, you could move on thinking that from that premise, you can create a professional body that actually encompasses what you were mentioning. So values that take under consideration the environmental interest, the stability of the financial system, of the corporate sector, and so on. So it's something that is not yet there, but I think that type of profession has to underpin from that democratic basis. And I don't think that the competence and the values that we are talking about can be found in the private sector. I don't think that that decision-making that is required can be found in, I don't know, in business schools or in what we already have on boards of directors. That is my idea. And obviously, it's not something we could find ready-made at the moment in states. It's something that has to be created. But I think the state as a democratic institution is the starting point to create that new profession. I think one example I could make, but again, it's not something ready-made for the purpose. There are I think in France or Italy, some institutions, some state institutions that encompass that professional value. Probably, I don't know, I could think of the State Lawyer Council in Italy, which is a sort of state-based profession. The Autorité des Marchés Financiers in France, perhaps similarly. But again, it's not something ready-made, but it's the idea of a permanent body that has a democratic link with society.
Okay, Beata.
Thank you for very inspiring presentations from all of you. I wanted to follow up on that question and ask, could it be possible that the same thing could be done with duties on the directors and some kind of competence-raising initiatives that directors have to qualify, like you have to be a lawyer?
I think that's another possibility. I mean, in a longer version of what I talked about today, I talked about two routes to create this competence. One would be through a predetermined educational path, so create a sort of specific state academia, so a qualifying route to become a director. But that could be restricting in the sense of, would we have enough directors? So, yeah, I agree with you, that could be a path. Or otherwise, basically, you maintain a number of directors as they are now, but you pull these professionals from another body, and they create that sort of balancing of interest. But yeah, I think the qualifying issue, it can be quite interesting. Yeah.
Andres?
Thank you. One comment and one question. The comment is that while I appreciate your proposal, I think it could be something for the future. My experience, primarily from Sweden, is that some of the worst actors in the field of environmental protection and climate change mitigation efforts, also in the private sector, particularly in relation to public procurement, which I have been reviewing over the last couple of years, has been some of the state government agencies. They have an interpretation of economics that is so backward and so old-fashioned, and they have very direct links into the Ministry of Finance, and they have the same kind of views in a way. So again, going back to what I said this morning, unless we rethink the whole economic model and complement it and rethink the policy framework and sending new signals to all those people who are employed by government agencies, I don't think this is going to fly. I think it's going to be the opposite. My question to you is, I'm a little bit familiar with EMAS, and in my recollection, EMAS does not include performance standards. So is that something that you want to introduce? And if you want to do that, I think it's got to be a political decision somewhere, and then you will have the same kind of fight that you have on emission reductions or ETS or whatever. So please elaborate on how this could be instrumental in operation.
It's a classic form of procedural regulation, so it doesn't require any substantive environmental improvement. It doesn't say you must not pollute this much, you must not discharge this into the water. What it does require is firms to set their own quantifiable substantive targets. So that's the distinction. And in terms of regulatory scholarship, it's quite important that firms do this, because there's plenty of environmental proceduralization which is useless unless it's geared towards a particular goal. Could you ask the second question again? I mean, are you saying, does this require political will? That applies to all environmental law. It's a continual struggle.
No, I appreciate that EMAS is a system where you have to go through a very elaborate process, you have to put some system in place, etc. But what my question was really, you imply that there are performance standards there or not, and if we are going to introduce them, that's going to be a hard issue.
Yeah, I mean, my view is that hard environmental performance standards are the function of external environmental law. My construction of the purpose of EMAS would be to mandate those types of processes at the company level. So it's serving a different purpose from substantive environmental law. It doesn't mean they're not related, because those processes that you would implement pursuant to EMAS would be supportive of those external environmental performance standards that are the staple of environmental law.
Okay.
Yes, I'm quite a charm of researcher at the University of Oslo. I come more from the human rights angle. Could you elaborate a bit? You said that EMAS is voluntary. Would you elaborate, explain a bit more on how it's applied for multinational companies? And then if some financial institutions use it as a standard, I think that would be useful.
Yeah.
And then regarding Dr. Master's presentation, I think that notion of company which poses a systemic risk, I know that notion was taken from the financial crisis for financial institutions, but I think it's an interesting notion both for environmental and human rights. You know, when you have a more accurate risk for human rights and environment, perhaps states and international regulation should be stronger. So that notion would be interesting. So if you can elaborate on the notion of
systemic risk fear.
Okay, so yeah, EMAS, it's an EU regulation, so it's called a quasi-public state-backed law that firms can opt to register for, but the obligations and the things that they have to do to comply with EMAS are quite exacting. The newest edition of EMAS, EMAS 3, is open to non-EU corporations, and so it competes on a global stage with the more well-known ISO 14001 series, which I think people are more familiar with. That's also an environmental management system. The uptake is higher than EMAS, but the reason why the uptake is higher is because the requirements or the obligations are much less exacting than EMAS, particularly on reporting and external validation. Does that answer your question? Oh yeah, and also it is used, because it's voluntary, you can use sort of EMAS mark in order to differentiate yourselves from competitors on an environmental stage. So it is sort of like a certificating regime. EMAS is not that popular, as it doesn't work as a voluntary measure because the obligations are so exacting, which is why companies tend to opt for ISO 14001, but ISO 14001, at least in comparison, isn't worth the paper that it's written on. EMAS is much, much more robust, which is why it's the preferable model.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, yep, sorry.
I don't really use the concept of systemic risk because that is more... Oh yeah, sorry. Can you? Yeah. I don't really use the idea of systemic risk. I tend to use, in this particular context, in this proposal, the idea of externalities that these firms create. So if they create externalities on a broader range of social constituencies, I argue, then those constituencies should be represented in an indirect way, of course, in the decision-making process. So that is the way I structure the idea. Systemic risk, I'm not entirely sure that the identification of significantly important systemic institution would encompass all those institutions that can actually trigger systemic effect, but that's another issue.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question regarding what we were talking about. If one could think of something not building on parallel, could we put on the board and require companies to put somebody on the board that has environmental and social background? Like we said, 40% of women have 40% of board has women. Could one just require that across the board? Because then you're not really, you're changing the composition of the board, because then it's not just finance people or the insiders.
Who'd like to respond to that one?
I mean, I don't think it was directed at me, but EMAS does sort of make stipulations that you have to have particular people with environmental responsibilities at varying levels of hierarchy. So it's not, the board does matter, but you need that sort of expertise across the range of the organisation, and EMAS has sort of requirements for that purpose. No, but because of the nature of the obligations, it tends to imply someone who is board specific. And if you were to design a similar model, you could, it would make sense, I think, to have that type of top level responsibility. I agree.
I think it's interesting. But I think if I can think of the financial sector, for instance, where in board of directors you needed to have, and you in fact had, an amount of non-executive directors who were on paper experts in some fields where that didn't work, firstly because they were not really independent as non-executive directors, and also, as we've seen in the context of the crisis, because their expertise was not really what was needed. So for a reason or the other, either they were not independent or they were not really expert, or their expertise was not what was needed. So I think we have to be really careful in picking who's supposed to be expert. Because you had professionals, you had academics who didn't really respond to what was required for them, out of them. So,
if I I could just add quickly, there have been shareholder proposals, you might be aware, asking certain companies, I think they're targeted mainly at oil companies, to make sure they have someone appointed to the board with environmental expertise. And I don't think any of those companies have taken up that call as of yet. But sort of going back to Beata's question earlier, Canada has a director certification program, I think a couple of them, and their annual conference last year was, the theme was sustainable development. So I think directors are interested in this topic, and director certification programs is one way to make sure that everyone on their board has some minimal level of knowledge of environmental issues.
I think that's an interesting point. I mean, you can draw perhaps the analogy with having somebody on the board dealing with risk, and that was one of the suggestions post-crisis, that there be a director dealing with risk. And the response was that if you have one person, well, then everyone will leave it to that person. And what you're trying to do with risk and what you're trying to do with environmental issues is to embed it in the thought process and the decision-making of all the directors. So as Gail said, you need a degree of expertise for everybody. But did you have a view on that particular question, or okay, sure, yeah.
I think another issue, as I think Andrew pointed out earlier, if we want to break the agency issue between directors and shareholders, I think we have to break the incentive system in place. So even if somebody is very competent, non-executive directors, for instance, have been caught in the web of agency issues. There is an agency problem among non-executive directors. They want to be reappointed. As long as non-executive directors or these experts are paid by the company, I think the problem will always be there. There will always be a risk of these incentives, really. Why nobody heeded warning signs of risk managers? There were warning signs, because there was this agency issue at stake. If these experts were not paid by the company, but by another entity, obviously their interest would be quite different.
Anders, and well, we'll start with you, and then we have three more. Yeah.
Professor, I understand it's in the middle of the night for you, so thank you very much for being with us. My question is pertaining to your proposal towards the end about the issuing of ecological money, interest-free, to make investments in alternative energy more likely and profitable. Would it be some kind of special drawing rights, or how would it function, and who would be behind such a system?
In the Great Depression, such money was issued privately by local communities, chambers of commerce, and the cost-carrying fee was 2% per week. And so they sold stamps. It was called stamp script. It was invented by Gazelle. It circulated in Germany, Austria, and the United States. And a bill was introduced into the American Congress to issue $1 trillion of this stamp script in 1933. But it was overtaken by the New Deal. The problem was, of course, that the stamps were sold by the post office. So the post office would collect the money rather than the Federal Reserve. And of course, the Federal Reserve didn't want to do that. While I've got the air, can I make some comments on some of the conversations I've just heard about having directors educated or qualified? Having started the first company directors education course in the world in 1975, I'm very skeptical about director education. I'm not skeptical about stakeholder action groups who are personally involved or harmed or threatened by environmental issues. And that's why I liked, the Kara's presentation, where she said you need real people who are motivated. But you've got to connect those who have the information to act. You've got to connect them with the power, capability, and the will to act. And at the moment, we have a disconnected form of capitalism when people aren't connected together. I'm also very skeptical about a legal approach. Making laws and imposing duties doesn't mean that they're going to be used. And making laws that give directors options means it doesn't be used. It's much more to corporate governance is about power. And people who are subject to power bend towards that power. And you've got to give the people concerned about the environment a voice and influence to affect the appointment and remuneration of the controllers of a firm. And that's why you've got to have divided power, because at the moment, Anglo corporations with a single board have absolute power to identify and manage their own conflicts of interest. And power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and it's quite irresponsible for having corporations with a single board where they combine governance powers with management powers. Thank you.
Dear Professor Turnbull, this is Tine Klamboy. I also do a bit of research on multinational enterprises, how they are structured, how they are legally structured, and what their business structure is. And their legal structure is based on shareholdings in subsidiaries, so legal ties, but at the same time there are also contractual ties. Think of joint venture companies, think of franchise companies, think of local presence establishments. So when you look at the multinational enterprise, you could already say that that's sort of a network society. And I don't know if it's possible to go back to your slide in which you present the stakeholder enterprise network that appoints the board of directors. I don't know, can we go back to this slide? My question is, can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Like, how do you see that in a practical way? How would you establish such action groups, and how would they vote for directors? Thank you.
The networks, the corporate constitution would give the right of any minimum group of stakeholders to be recognised by the constitution as having voice and power to advise on the key performance indicators for rewarding directors. Now, in a multinational corporation like you brought up, you'd need different stakeholder groups in different countries for different functions in different areas. And what I presented in the slide in Figure 1 was a generic simplified version. When you look when you get practical in details, it needs to be custom designed for each occasion. I've designed an education course for teaching people how to be governance architects. In other words, how to answer your question, because you can't do it. It's got to be answered specifically for a specific case. And all I presented today was a simplified generic case. And it'll take longer than this session to fully and properly answer your question. But thank you for your inquiry.
Okay, I think it's clear because we are looking now at Figure 1. So we understand that it's a generic form that we can use in law school teaching in corporate law classes. And do you have a paper on this that we can also maybe study?
Sorry, was that a question to me?
Yes. Is there a paper? Is there a paper? Okay, there's a paper, so we can also study that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
One was David's and one was Beata's. We talked about trying to balance conflicting interests. Beata is the example in point because she wants to ask a really pressing question, but she wants things to run on time. So which is going to win out? We leave her muddling with that one. David, did you want to and we probably have 1 or 2 minutes left.
And I just wanted to say to the participants of the session that we just completed now, that I thought it was all very inspiring and good. Carrie touched upon the limitations of environmental law, and that's an important reason that we need to integrate this into company law, is also to make more effective the environmental law. And I think that Carrie's ideas about EMAS, or a revised version of that mandated, could be very interesting as enforcement. But I want to say that all presentations, also those that didn't get a chance to elaborate in the panel debate, gave very valuable input to how we could formulate this in detail, where we all know the devil is. Thank you.